How tall was the biblical giant Og? Og, the mighty king of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim, is portrayed in much of Midrashic literature as a massive giant who survived the biblical flood, who desired to be wed to the matriarch Sarah, and finally met his demise by the hand of Moses hundreds of years later. The Israelite victory over Og was such a major defeat that the event was immortalized in the Psalms. Og's height has been the subject of much discussion throughout the ages. Og's biography via the text of Midrashic literature make for a tall tale, to say the least. All that said, was this what the rabbis had in mind when they composed these homiletical texts? Can we actually ascertain Og's height from the scant appearance in the Bible? This video will provide a brief overview of the primary biblical and Talmudic sources dealing with the question of Og's height, as well as how these texts were understood by some of the great Jewish scholars of the medieval period. This subject is as broad as Og was reputed to be tall, and therefore I will only be dealing with the basic questions. For those interested in going down the rabbit hole completely, I have provided links in the description to sources that go into greater detail. For full transparency, I am treating the narrative in Deuteronomy as historic, and I will only be providing the most rationalist explanations for the text we will be exploring. Og is only mentioned a handful of times in the Bible. There is a possible passing mention to his height found in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 11. We are told that he was the last of the Rephaim. We meet up with this term 3 other times in the Torah. In the Torah, Rephaim refers to a people distinguished by their enormous stature. Elsewhere in the Bible, the word is used to denote the dead or spirits. The verse in Deuteronomy 3:11 further tells us that his iron eris was in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, by the cubit of man. I deliberately didn't translate the word eris in the verse, and deliberately said by the cubit of man. This is because in the original Hebrew, the verse can be understood in a few different ways. First, the word eris. According to some, it could be understood as a citadel. This would mean that the verse was not referring to his physical stature, but rather to a fortress with walls 9 cubits high and 4 cubits thick. The walls were not literally made of iron, but rather hyperbole to refer to the strength of the walls. Others understood the word eris to be referring to a child's crib. This opinion seeks to drive home that even as a baby, Og was huge. Finally, there is the most popular translation of the word eris, which is rendered as a bedstead. The traditional Jewish commentaries are divided as to whose cubit is being referenced when the verse states the cubit of man. Some understood it to be referring to the king's cubit, or that of the Rephaim. Others understood it to be referring to that of an average man, while still others understand it as referring to the cubits of Og himself. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra raises serious questions on the final approach. He posits that if one were to go by the cubit of Og, the verse would not be teaching us as to how large his bedstead was, as we don't know the size of his cubit. Most who learn this portion of scripture understand eris as a bedstead, and the size of the cubit to be that of an average man. As such, we will also be using this opinion. This is not to say that the citadel translation is wrong, or preclude the fact that Og could have been the size of an average person. The smallest height rendering found in a rabbinic work is that of Maimonides. He mentions that a bed is about a third larger than its occupant. Therefore, Og would have been around 6 cubits tall. Using the smallest measurement that we know of, the Egyptian common cubit, which comes in at 17.4 inches, Og would have been 8 feet 7 inches tall. This is definitely within the realm of the human experience, albeit the upper limits of height potential. If Og was indeed this tall, he and Goliath would be in a contest for the tallest person to have lived in antiquity. If all this is true, why is Og envisioned as this super mega tall giant? We have Talmudic homiletics to thank for that. The most famous of these is in the Babylonian Talmud tractate Brachot 54b. There, the Talmud discusses the requirement to say a blessing of thanks when one sees the rock that Og was going to throw on the Israelite camp. it says the following: with regard to the rock that Og, king of Bashan, sought to throw upon Israel, there is no biblical reference, but rather a tradition that was transmitted. The Talmud relates that Og said, "How large is the camp of Israel? It is 3 parsangs in length and width. I will go up and uproot a mountain 3 parsangs long, and I will hurl it upon them and kill them." He went and uprooted a mountain and brought it on his head. And the Holy One, blessed be He, brought grasshoppers upon it. And they pierced the peak of the mountain, and it fell upon his neck. Passages like this were used historically in polemics against Judaism to show how irrational the religion was. The problem with these critiques was that these Christian polemicists were already preaching to the choir. These portions of Talmud contain deep esoteric teachings of an allegorical nature. They were never meant to be taken literally. This was the consensus across the spectrum of rabbinic scholarship, from the most rationalist of rabbis to the most mystical. In fact, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, also known as the Rashba, who was very critical of aggressive allegorical interpretation, went out of his way to explain this passage allegorically. For the sake of brevity, I will not quote it here. One can follow the links in the description to find out more about it. Despite the understandings of the rabbis, the literal understanding of many of these passages entered into Jewish folklore. In fact, it would seem, from some fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the idea of Og being a supergiant was already popular in the 2nd century BCE. As in the case of the Talmud, in these fragments of scroll, Og is portrayed as a mega-giant that lived for hundreds of years. I believe the reason for this is because people gravitate towards the fantastic. Imagine small children sitting spellbound listening to a master storyteller jumping from one tale to another. These stories are here to stay. We will never know how tall Og actually was, but one thing is for certain: he cast a giant's shadow. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to smash that like button. Thanks for watching and have a wonderful day.